Hey everyone, God bless you. Thanks a lot for tuning in to this Tech Tuesday. My reflection today is on the subject of books and how books changed us, how books altered the human race. And that form of technology of the printing press had an incredible and expansive influence in so many areas of life. I think if we understand that, then we can understand perhaps the incredible impact of modern technology, especially of digital or screen technology on us. So we usually discuss the creation of book printing in the 15th century, in 1450 in Germany, right, with Johannes Gutenberg. Ironically, Gutenberg himself was a Catholic, and the first thing that he printed on his press was an indulgence, a papal indulgence. No doubt if he could see how the Protestants would use just 70 years later, use his press to propagate Protestantism and lead to the overthrow of Catholicism in half of Europe, I think he would have pulled his hair out. Ironically, also, the first books that were published in the New World, where I'm speaking from, the first book published in the New World was in 1537 in Mexico City, where a Spanish printer set up the first printing press. And believe it or not, he published, get this, St. John of Sinai's Ladder of Divine Ascent. Can you imagine? The first book that was published in America, in the colonies, was published in 1640 by the widow of a Puritan preacher who actually passed away in the traveling from Britain to America. This is 1638, he died. His wife inherited his printer and set up the first print shop in America in 1640 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And the first book that was published was something called the Bay Psalter, which was a complete translation of the Psalms from Hebrew. What a great start, huh? What a great start in the New World. If only we could have maintained that course and direction. 50 years after the printing press had been invented, by 1500, something like 8 million books had been published. 8 million books. There were something like 3,000 printers in Italy alone by 1500. This is how the technology just exploded. 8 million books in existence. If we go 100 years ahead from 1500 to 1600, we go from 150 to 200 million books. There's an interesting article in Volume 2 of the History of Technology on the subject of printing by a man named Michael Clapham, and he says something about this. I want to read it to you. He says, a man born in 1453, the year of the fall of Constantinople, could look back from his 50th year on a lifetime in which about 8 million books had been printed, more perhaps than all the scribes of Europe had produced since Constantine founded his city in AD 330. Can you imagine? The number of books that scribes had successfully written from the time of Constantine until the fall of Constantinople was about the same amount of books that were produced in Europe between 1450 and 1500. This is what the printing press did for the accessibility of knowledge. And the very form of the book had tremendous impact. Let me share some of the impacts of the very form of the book. Christians in general, Christian leaders in Western Europe hailed the printing press as God's gift to man, as a gift to advance many aspects of the work of the church, like evangelism, like catechism, the harmonization of liturgical texts. Can you imagine all the churches not having common liturgical books, and therefore the variety and the inconsistency in worship practices was much higher prior to printing. Religious tracts became commonly published, calendars, devotional literature, and of course, Bibles, and the impact on Christians in being able to have a copy of the biblical text themselves. You know, if you read the church fathers, let's say from the 4th and 5th century, someone like St. John Chrysostom, you can see references to how the people of God would consider just a little piece of paper with some scripture written on it to be precious. Chrysostom says many people would just have a few verses from the gospel rolled up and in a little pendant that they would wear around their neck and considered themselves to be very blessed. Or maybe a portion of the scripture just written on the wall that they would kiss going in and out of their house. But almost no one had any copies of the epistles, for instance, of St. Paul, or any gospel texts. That was just far beyond the purview and the financial capability of most Christian people. And so to be able to have copies of the Holy Scriptures in your house, just think of how precious it is to you. You never have to worry about finding a copy of the Scriptures to read, but that isn't the case for 3/4 of Christian history. Here's some stats on that. Between the invention of the printing press, 1450, and 1520, so that's a 70-year period, 156 Latin editions of the Bible had been printed. 17 German translations had been printed, and the first was done 20 years before Martin Luther was even born. The Bible became accessible to the people. Pedagogy was altered by the creation of books. Rhyme and cadence were no longer key and instrumental for preserving knowledge. Collective memory was changed. The way people learned. Standardization became normative. Lists of errata, lists of errors were passed around and printed. And so if you printed a book and it had errors in it, the printer could simply print one sheet to update, to put into your book to show you where the mistakes were. And that led to the harmonization of texts. There wasn't such a wide variance in important texts that would be passed down from generation to generation. Also, texts became far more dependable. Corrupted copies became improved editions, which were the product of new, larger groups of correspondents and editors that facilitated the production of new publications. Scholars used to, before the printing press, assume that the older the book, the more corrupt it was, the edition that they had in their copies, and that ceased. That simply stopped being the case. It also led to new preservation possibilities. Vanishing manuscripts and drifting texts were no longer the norm. People began to publish bibliographies of texts, which came into existence. This the printing press enabled regularly numbered pages, pagination to be common, punctuation marks, section breaks, running heads, title pages. They all became commonplace. And of course, once you established a reading apparatus like that, it affects how you read it. So for instance, for most of Christian history, the Bible was not presented to the faithful in one single book. It wasn't presented, for instance, in chapters and verses. And today we read the books of the Bible, often by chapters. Right now, I'm reading through the scriptures with my parish. We're reading through the Bible in a year, many of us together. And we're reading it according to chapter and verse. And this, of course, imposes an interpretive scheme upon the text itself. So, for instance, if you're reading St. Paul's epistle to the Philippians, you now think that it has 4 chapters. The original text didn't have 4 chapters. It was one extended epistle. And the place where you stop and the place where you start now is marked out for you. But that may not have been the place Paul wanted you to stop, or maybe wanted you to start. We're now reading the text with this imposition. Because the printing process ensured that the same information fell on the same pages, page numbering, tables of contents, and indices became common, though they were previously almost exclusively unknown. The form of reading itself changed, moving over several centuries from oral reading to now much of the reading was done silently and done privately, not in public. It also, the printing press also had a tremendous impact on schooling itself. The creation of books and the common acquisition of books increased the numbers of schools like crazy. So in 1480, before the information explosion brought by the printing press, there were about 34 schools in all of England. By 1660, there were 440 schools registered. Information was, shall we say, on the loose. Libraries in schools and cities and churches exploded, together with newspapers that brought timely information into communities and provided a forum for important debate. Just think about how the printing press, the technology, has altered education and evaluation. In contemporary education, in our school system today, in the postmodern West, we can't imagine a school system that doesn't have grades and tests. We think that's the very essence of education. But these are very much, these pedagogical standards are very much the fruit of books and book learning. The first evidence that history provides us of any student papers ever being graded is in Cambridge University in 1792, in the classroom of a tutor named William Farish. Did education begin in 1792? I don't think so. I don't think so. The book had to reconcile with oral instruction, and for 400 plus years, pedagogues have tried to do this and found ways to combine book learning and rhetoric, individual reading with communal instruction in the classroom. This is what teachers faced. This is what they had to do in light of the fact that they were using books and their pupils were reading books now. The printing press was also a significant a factor in the establishment, especially of scientific communities and collaborative groups of scholars. This is what was enabled. The printing press led to the development of scholarly journals, helping to bring about the scientific revolution. Scientists shared their writings with each other. Just think about how much collaboration goes on today through the internet. Groups of scholars studying, for instance, specific texts from a specific era in a specific language. They have study groups and they read common text that they share and they collaborate, which enables them to make incredible progress. Well, lots of areas of scientific inquiry that we have today were really brought into existence. They exploded on the scene, so to speak, because of the creation of books. Scientific areas of inquiry were very much dependent on the printing press. Areas like anatomy, botany, zoology, that required a lot of graphs and diagrams that were simply too hard for scribes to copy in great detail. But once the printing press was invented, these complex graphs and charts and diagrams could be copied and multiplied. From the time of Gutenberg, for the next 200 years, the wider availability of printed materials led to also the dramatic increase in adult literacy, which had a tremendous impact upon the West. For instance, here in America, it's unthinkable to understand America and the rise of American democracy and Republican form of government without high levels of literacy. America is absolutely the first country ever argued into existence in print. Read the Federalist Papers and the commentary of Americans on them, and you'll see how important the written word was for the creation of America. You could say the same about the Protestant Reformation and its connection to the printing press. I remember when I was a young man going through my grandfather's papers after he had passed away and being amazed at the literacy that he had as an 8th grader. I remember seeing some theft that he had kept. He died at almost 90 years of age. And I remember reading through some of his papers and thinking to myself, you know, I don't think a high school senior and maybe even a college student could pass the tests that he had passed when he was only in 8th grade. The level of literacy in America was so high in its early life. For instance, in In the works of the great American preacher Jonathan Edwards, this is 1703 to 1758, he describes that his parishioners, who were mostly farmers, would be plowing their fields, and they would have a copy of the New Testament, and they would be doing their devotions while they were plowing the field with their scriptures right on the plow. They would have the original Greek text of the New Testament there, and they would be reading it while they were plowing. We can't even imagine such things, that level of education. The printing press was the most important step in the democratization of knowledge. It had a tremendous impact upon political principles being widely disseminated and embraced by the populace. The more knowledge that became public, the more it stood firm and became irrevocable. For instance, imagine the Magna Carta, 1215, which was to be publicly read, was to be proclaimed twice a year. By 1237, there was already debate about the text and if it had been altered and if what the villages were hearing, what the provinces were hearing was actually the original Magna Carta or not. Governments used the press to communicate with their subjects, to announce declarations of war, to publish battle accounts, to promulgate treatises, to argue disputed points, etc. Within 50 or 60 years of the invention of the printing press, the entire classical canon had been reprinted and widely promulgated throughout Europe. More people had access to knowledge, both new and old. More people could discuss these works. Latin had become eclipsed by the rise of vernacular publications in all fields of study. And the printed word also helped to unify and standardize the spelling and the syntax of these vernaculars, decreasing their variability. Printing altered methods of data collection, of data storage, of retrieval systems and communication networks. Tons of how-to books came into existence that had never before existed. Just like people today are becoming instant authors and influencers through YouTube, it was the same with the publication of books. Authors just exploded on the scene. The very technology itself of books had such a pervasive impact on society, from personal study habits to the forms of pedagogy in our schools to political movements that are with us to this day, none of which would have been the case without books. Books have had an incredible impact upon the human race. And before we set them aside, before we decide that we don't need books in our hands anymore, all we need is the screen, we really ought to size up what the books have actually meant to us. God be with you.